Welcome in San Diego, it's Jade Hindman. For today's show, we are talking with award-winning author Jesmyn Ward on her approach to writing historical fiction novels and why she thinks they're so important. This is KPBS Midday Edition, connecting our communities through conversation. The annual Writer Symposium by the Sea kicks off at Point Loma Nazarene University this week. This year's lineup features novelist Jesmyn Ward. Jesmyn is one of the most celebrated writers in American fiction today. Two of her novels, Sing, Unburied, Sing, and Salvage the Bones, have won the prestigious National Book Award. Her other work includes the memoir Men We Reaped and her most recent novel, Let Us Descend. She is also a MacArthur Fellow and the youngest person to be awarded the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, and she'll be appearing at the symposium tomorrow, February 26th. Jesmyn, welcome to Midday.
It's good to be here.
So glad to have you. So the theme for this year's symposium is Writing That Redeems. How does that theme resonate with you?
I think, with the sort of type of people that I write about in my fiction, because I write about, just sort of normal, everyday people who are, many of them, because of who they are, like mostly sort of poor Black people from the South, right? Like they're doing the best that they can with what they have. And I don't know. And I think that in all the stories I tell, that those characters are redeemed in some way, because either they sort of realize something about their lives, or they find a different direction in their lives, or, just I think sometimes just in the fact that they are able to tell their stories and share their stories, that is redeeming in some aspect.
Absolutely. Many of your books are set in this fictional Mississippi town of Bois Sauvage, which is actually inspired by where you grew up. I mean, can you talk about the role of place in your stories and how you've really brought this town to life over the course of your work?
hmm Yeah, I mean, it was important to me when I first began writing to avoid writing, specifically about my town, right? I didn't want it to be called, because my little hometown is called DeLille. So I didn't want to write specifically about DeLille. I wanted to write about a fictional version of DeLille because I felt like it gave me a certain amount of freedom. But at the same time, even though I'm writing about a fictional, sort of version of my town, I'm still, I think, being sort of loyal and honest in a way, and like acknowledging the responsibility that I have to write about the truths, that like, I don't know, that inform the way that people live
Hmm.
in my hometown. I mean, so that's why I write about things like hurricanes and natural disasters and generational poverty, and sort of what that does to a person. That's why I also write about incarceration. So yeah, I think, that the multiple realities that come from living in a place like this, that they inform, who my characters are, what they've lived through, what they've seen, the choices that they think that they have, and the choices that they make in their lives.
Right. And how do you approach that in your storytelling? Because, as you've mentioned, many of your characters have this complicated relationship with their hometown and its history.
hmm I don't know. I mean, I feel like it has to be acknowledged in the work, because that's the kind of fiction that I write, right? Like that's the kind of fiction that I'm invested in writing. Like fiction that sort of sinks into a time and a place with a character and really allows the reader to inhabit that moment with them, right? So I try to make the character and the place that they live in and the circumstances that they're living through as real and as present as I can. And I think that acknowledging, all of those sort of like outside issues, that is part, I think, of making the characters as, sort of real and as present as you can.
Hmm. And your books, they're grounded in these very real issues, but they're also steeped in magic and spirituality, grief, loss, the afterlife. Sing, Unburied, Sing has this element of magical realism that can be deeply felt through the story. What pulls you to write about magic and the supernatural?
Well, I think I it was something it's something that I've always been curious about, and I feel like it's something that I've been writing towards for a long time. But honestly, I feel like writing about sort of the supernatural or the unexpected, or writing stories where there's an element of spirit. I think that it's better reflective of the community that I grew up in and the ways that the people around me understood the world, right?
Hmm.
Like I have sort of stories, right, from like my great grandparents. One of my great grandmothers would always tell us this story about how our great grandfather died, and then after he died, he came back to her as a ghost and told her never to get married again, never to marry again, right? And
Hmm.
she didn't marry. And she had told us that story over and over again. And as a kid, like I heard that, and I just took it to be true, right? I understood that that was the way that the world worked, right? That even after people that you love died or passed away, that didn't mean that they just evaporated into the ether. They could come back, they could still communicate with you, they could still, I don't know, inform your life in different ways. And so yeah, I don't know, I feel like exploring that sort of spiritual or supernatural element in my work is another way for me to be honest about the kind of people that I'm writing about, and honest about like the realities of their lives, because, many of the people who are like the people I write about, like people in my community and people in my family, they do believe that there's something more.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Out there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing how connected Black people are to spirituality, even despite the transatlantic slave trade,
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
because that was something that was very much a part of, I won't say religion, but spirituality across many African
Mhm.
tribes and countries.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was really important for me to explore that in my last novel, to like incorporate a certain, I don't know, writing that engaged with spirit or that acknowledged spirits and different worlds, because I feel like that belief that people had, right,
Hmm.
in the fact that there was something beyond what they were experiencing, like that it enabled them to survive, right, that experience, and also to thrive in spite of that experience. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, take us back to when your love for reading and writing first blossomed. Was there a specific moment that started this journey for you?
I so I actually I wasn't unfortunately I wasn't one of those kids who I wanted to be one of those children whose brains are hardwired and they just sort of just can read at age 3. But I wasn't that kid, but I wanted to read so badly. So then when I finally learned how to read in in first grade, I immediately loved it. I think because I had wanted it. I just wanted it so much. And so of course I was a reader before I was a writer. And when I was young, books just seemed magical to me. It seemed like the authors were doing sort of magic when they and creating worlds and creating characters and making you feel for those characters in those worlds, and really immersing you in an experience, and so I think I had that desire to write from a very young age, but I didn't fully commit to it until after I graduated from college. And I at that time, that was sort of I was reading, a lot of the writers from the Harlem Renaissance. I was reading, Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Tazaki Shange, right? So I was reading all these brilliant, Black American writers, and I don't know,
Hmm.
and they were, I think, providing me with a model, multiple models, for how to be a writer, right? And a writer, I guess, who looked like me, right? And
Hmm.
who came from the sort of background like I did, right, in this country.
Yeah, talk more about that. I mean, how did you see your own experiences reflected in their work? You know, the work of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I I think that one of the things that was most remarkable to me about all of their work, all the not only Black American writers, but writers of color. Like I remember loving Louise Erdrich's work when I was younger. I also loved Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work when I was younger, right? I'm speaking broadly, like in high school and then in college. But I think that one of the things that drew me to their work and that was so remarkable about their work is that when I read them, I feel like I was seeing people who resemble the kind of people that I grew up with, the kind of people who were members of my family, kind of people who were in my community, right? And I was like seeing those same sort of people like on the page for the first time. And that was really powerful for me. I think because one of the reasons that I even like committed to writing was because and to telling stories was because I had experienced an act of erasure, right?
Hmm.
So when I was in my early 20s, my brother was 19 and he was killed by a drunk driver, right? And the drunk driver who killed him was never held accountable for his death. And that drunk driver was charged with the only thing that that drunk driver was like charged with was and convicted of was leaving the scene of an accident, right? And that felt like it felt like an act of erasure, right? It was as if he didn't matter, right? As if his life, as if he hadn't even, you know, as if he hadn't lived, right? And so after my brother passed, I wanted to push back against that in my work, right, and in my art, and I wanted to specifically write about my brother, write about kids like my brother, write about, you know, I think all the people that I grew up with and knew and loved and saw around me who had been erased, maybe not as dramatically as my brother had, but who had suffered erasure, different kinds of erasure. And I think like all of those writers that I named earlier, who I found, in my late teens and my early 20s, they showed me that it could be done, right?
Hmm.
That the people, like the people I love and like the people who I still love, right? And who I feel a certain responsibility to represent in my work, like that I could write about them and they could be complicated and whole people on the page. And if I worked hard enough at it and if I did it well enough, I could make someone who is a complete stranger, right, to those sorts of people, like I could inspire some empathy in those people. Like I could make
Hmm.
those people feel some empathy, and feel with, the people that I write about.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, part of the reason I became a journalist.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm so sorry to hear about your brother and what happened there. You know,
Thank you.
your book "Let Us Descend" is
Hmm.
it's a historical fiction and
Hmm.
born from a piece of American history that had been erased, specifically the role that New Orleans played in the U.S. slave trade. You know, today the erasure of history, specifically Black history, and really anything that underscores the morally bankrupt aspects of American imperialism, sort of
Hmm.
continues to be under attack. So,
Hmm.
how are you thinking about these attempts at erasure and the impact it could have on our country?
I mean, it's tragic. It's terrible. I mean, in a way, I feel like, it's one of the reasons that I really wanted to write Letters to Sin because, I grew up, in Mississippi. Both sides of my family have lived here for generations, right? Most of us existing pretty close to the poverty line, right? And when I was growing up, because I didn't learn the full story of like the full scope of American history, right?
Hmm.
Probably like many kids, um, growing up in the 80s and the 90s in America, especially in the South, right? And because I learned this sort of truncated version of American history, I think it made it very difficult for me to begin to understand why generations of my family, had been living in the South in poverty, or, why we were on government assistance when I grew up, or why, while other kids seem to have so much, at least, from what I could see from the outside, in some ways we had so little. And then that colored, that informed everything. I mean, I remember, applying for colleges when I was in high school, right? And getting this pushback from some of my schoolmates
Hmm.
who were white saying, oh, the only reason that you got into this school and this school is because of affirmative action, right? But because I, knew nothing about or knew little, right, about what affirmative action was established to redress,
Hmm.
I couldn't push back against that the narrative that was being imposed on me, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I'm a big proponent, and this is why, again, why I wanted to write Letters to Sin, because I'm a big proponent of, I think books are keys. And I think that books are keys because they open, doors to knowledge that helps us better understand our existence, right? They help us to better understand the world that we live in, and help us to better navigate the world that we live in, right?
Hmm.
And so I wanted to write Let Us Descend because people, I wanted to give the kid that I was at least one key to sort
Yeah.
of better understand that reality.
Yeah. And then, too, like you said before, for others it helps build empathy and it answers the question
Right,
of why, for
right,
so many people.
right.
I'd love to hear more about Let Us Descend because
Hmm.
this novel is so rich with your storytelling and also has this connection to Dante's Inferno, which is one of
Hmm.
my favorite works. Why did you choose this connection in your book and how does it all come together?
It was funny enough, it was actually sort of by chance in a way. I was walking past my bookshelf, and that particular bookshelf that I was walking past has, multiple volumes of poetry. And one that caught my eye was Dante's Inferno. And perhaps part of the reason that it caught my eye was because, I wanted Annis, who is the enslaved girl who's at the heart of the story of Let Us Descend, like I wanted her to have access to stories and knowledge outside of her own experience, right? And so I thought, well, if there are other young people in this household, right, her half sisters, right, who are fully white, who are being educated, right, then maybe she can have access to knowledge outside of her experience, like through their education. And so I just saw the Inferno on my bookshelf one day and I thought, well, I could see, these sort of young women, like it would make sense that that is something that they would learn, maybe, right? And so I picked up the Inferno and I started rereading it, right? Because the last time I read it, it was like 20 years ago. And so I started to reread it. And I already knew that Annis's journey would involve being sold south, right? From the upper south to the lower south, right? From the Carolinas, and that she would have to travel by foot, down to the slave markets, the slave pens of New Orleans. And so when I began to think about, about that journey, not only like geographically, right? Because she's going from a more hilly, like mountainous, elevated region down, 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 right, to the coast, which is at sea level. So she's descending geographically, but I think that the hardships and the horrors of slavery
Hmm.
were became even more, I don't know, violent, the further south that you went. And so it seemed like her journey sort of mirrored the journey that the characters take in the Inferno. So I thought, well, maybe that could be a model, right? That I could use to structure Annis's journey south.
Yeah. So, like, The further south she went, each experience
Mm.
sort of represented each ring of purgatory.
Right, right.
Yeah. There's this quote: to understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi. Do you
Mhm.
feel like your work and Southern literature as a whole embodies our country?
I do. I think, I love that quote because I think that perhaps in other places in the country that maybe it's easier to divorce yourself in some way from history, from the realities of history. But I think here that I feel like that history feels very present, right? And I think it's easier perhaps to understand in a place like this how history echoes in the present, right? I mean, I wrote about New Orleans and Let Us Descend, but I there are multiple monuments, for Confederates there. There are the actual slave pens that are still there. There are the beautiful sort of mansions, right, along the river, right, that were built, by enslaved people, right, and through the labor of enslaved people. And so I don't know. I just think that history is very much present in the landscape still here. I think that presence clarifies, I think for many people, the I don't know, the sort of the true were origins of this country, right?
Hmm.
That, that we aren't all hymns and willing seekers, right? That I don't know, that there was an uglier
Underbelly.
truth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
truth.
underbelly there, right.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's a history that never leaves us. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Well, it's been such a joy talking with you. I have been speaking with author Jesmyn Ward. She'll be at Point Loma Nazarene University's Writer Symposium by the Sea tomorrow. The event starts at 7 p.m. You can purchase tickets on the Warwick's Bookstore website. Ticket holders will also receive a copy of Let Us Descend. Jesmyn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. I'm your host, Jade Hindman. Thanks for tuning in to Midday Edition. Be sure to have a great day on purpose, everyone.